What if the version of history we inherited, the tidy sequence of civilizations rising, falling, and passing their wisdom forward, was never the real story at all? What if the milestones we treat as foundations are only fragments of something older, deeper, and deliberately eclipsed by time? Imagine our timeline not as a straight path, but as a landscape full of sinkholes, entire eras swallowed in silence, leaving behind ruins that don't match the narratives we built to explain them. Because scattered across the world, from the deserts of the Near East to the river plains of Asia to the forests of the Americas, lie traces of civilizations that should not exist in the form they do. Cities that appear fully formed, technologies that arrive without ancestors, collapses that happen with impossible speed, and gaps so large they feel less like accidents and more like erasures. These gaps are not empty. They breathe. They pull at the edges of what we think we know. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the echo of something humanity once understood. A memory buried beneath sand, stone, ash, and fear. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. It begins the way so many turning points in human history begin. Not with the rise of a new power, but with the disappearance of one. A silence spreading across once luminous lands, swallowing entire cultures as if they had stepped out of the world while no one was watching. And in that silence, the first hints that our historical timeline is less a continuous chain and more a shattered mosaic, whose missing shards might hold the real story. When we look at the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, we don't see a slow transition or a graceful decline. We see a world that collapses so swiftly it almost defies natural explanation. Cities that had thrived for centuries fall within a single lifetime. Trade networks that once stitched continents together unravel like threads in a burning tapestry. Writing systems vanish, metallurgical traditions disappear, and populations disperse as if pushed by forces they cannot understand. Archaeologists still sift through the destruction layers, bands of ash and splintered stone that run like scars beneath the soil. And those layers tell a story not of simple invasion or isolated misfortune, but of a systemic unraveling so complete that it feels less like a fall and more like a purge. Picture a world where kingdoms communicate across thousands of miles, exchanging metals, grain, diplomatic gifts, and knowledge through a network as intricate as any modern economy. A world where the Hittites govern a vast Anatolian empire through bureaucracies that map every field, every tax, every soldier. Where the Mycenaeans in Greece build palatial command centers, storing agricultural surplus in clay tablets that track harvests down to the last measure of barley. Where Canaanite merchants travel by sea to trade cedar, purple dye, and copper. Where Egypt shines as the towering anchor of the region, its monuments rising like stone beacons over a land that has mastered irrigation and record-keeping for millennia. If you walked through these cities at their peak, you would hear dozens of languages, see multicultural artisans working side by side, watch caravans and ships moving along established routes linking the Aegean, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and beyond. This was not a primitive world stumbling toward sophistication. It was a globalized system, a web of dependencies so advanced that its collapse feels almost impossible, until you realize how delicately everything was balanced. Within a few decades, that entire web snaps. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, burns so fiercely that its limestone melts into a glassy sheen. The great palace of Pylos in Greece, once a center of intricate record-keeping, leaves behind its last clay tablets, fired accidentally by the flames that consumed it, mentioning coastal watchers bracing for an attack no one could stop. Ugarit, a thriving port city and diplomatic hub, sends desperate messages for aid. But by the time those pleas arrive, the city is already in ruins. Even the Minoan palace at Knossos, long a symbol of maritime influence, becomes an empty husk. More than 40 major settlements across the eastern Mediterranean show the same abrupt evidence of destruction. Not a drawn-out struggle, not a gradual decline, a synchronized shattering. What could do this? Ancient Egyptian inscriptions speak of invaders they called the Sea Peoples, confederations of migrants or warriors arriving in waves across the Mediterranean. Some depictions show battles across the Nile Delta, ships ramming each other, archers firing from elevated platforms, desperate infantry clashing along the riverbanks. But even those inscriptions hint that the collapse was already underway, long before these attackers appeared. The Sea Peoples may have been participants in the chaos, but they were likely not its origin. They themselves may have been refugees pushed outward by events far beyond any single kingdom's control. Other explanations have been proposed, droughts stretching across decades, turning fields barren and triggering famine, shifts in trade patterns as essential resources became scarce, earthquake storms, a phenomenon where multiple severe quakes strike within a short time along the same fault zones, or systemic fragility, a kind of ancient domino effect where one kingdom's fall cascades into the next. But each explanation alone feels insufficient. Drought does not burn cities to ash. Earthquakes do not cause the universal loss of literacy. Invaders do not uniformly erase written systems across multiple continents. The collapse seems to combine all these factors, as if the world's most complex system had reached a threshold beyond which even small disruptions could trigger a total reset. In the centuries that follow, something even stranger happens. The survivors forget. They forget how their ancestors once wrote, traded, and governed. The Greeks lose their writing system entirely, entering a period later called the Dark Age, where no one remembers that tablets ever held the details of every harvest and every expedition. Egypt retreats inward, weakened and fragmented, its international correspondence dwindling into provincial concerns. The Hittite Empire vanishes so completely that for more than 2,000 years, no one knows it ever existed, until archaeologists uncover its remnants in the 19th century. It's as if the lights go out across an entire region, leaving the next generations to rebuild from fragments without understanding what those fragments once meant. What makes this moment so unsettling is not only the scale of loss, but the eerie silence it leaves behind. Before the collapse, the Bronze Age world was noisy. Scribes recording shipments in cuneiform, merchants shouting across markets, diplomats sending clay tablets sealed with intricate markings. After the collapse, the record drops to almost nothing, like a sudden interruption in a long-running broadcast. The gap is so wide that by the time civilization resurges centuries later, much of what existed before has faded into myth. Heroes whose deeds were once administrative entries become legends. Cities that were documented hubs of commerce become the settings of epics. The difference between history and memory blurs until no one can distinguish what was preserved from what was reinvented. And yet even this vast collapse reveals only the first layer of the mystery. Because when a system this advanced collapses this completely, it suggests something deeper, that complexity itself can hide vulnerabilities capable of erasing entire civilizations. It raises the question of whether humanity has risen and fallen in similar patterns before, leaving behind traces we have not yet recognized or have misinterpreted as anomalies. When we look at those layers of destruction, at the burned palaces and abandoned ports, we aren't just seeing the end of one era. We are seeing the outline of a missing chapter, a void large enough to reshape everything we assume about the development of human society. The Bronze Age collapse stands as one of the clearest reminders that history is not a steady march of progress, but a precarious ascent with cliffs hidden beneath the fog. Civilizations can vanish faster than they rise. Knowledge can evaporate in a single lifetime. And entire worlds can be swallowed by forces too intricate to fit into a simple cause and effect explanation. When we step back and examine the pattern from a distance, we begin to sense the possibility that the collapse was not merely an event, but a boundary point, a shadowed threshold separating what we know from what came before, a marker hinting that our understanding of ancient history may be built upon the ruins of civilizations far older, far stranger, and far more vulnerable than we have dared to imagine. If the late Bronze Age collapse reveals how quickly knowledge can evaporate, then the centuries that followed show how profoundly that loss can reshape an entire continent. When the Western Roman Empire finally slipped into silence in 476 CE, it did not explode outward in flames, nor did it collapse with theatrical finality. Instead, it simply dissolved. Bureaucracies that once stretched across 3 continents unraveled thread by thread. Markets emptied, roads cracked, stone buildings faded into the background as new generations forgot how to maintain them. And yet, the ruins themselves remained, quiet, imposing, and eerily hollow, remnants of a world whose logic no longer made sense to the people walking among them. Rome had not just fallen. It had been forgotten in a way that seems almost impossible for a civilization that once documented everything from grain shipments to political rivalries with obsessive precision. The true mystery of this era isn't the fall of Rome. It's the darkness that follows, the centuries in which Europe's memory fractures. Literacy, once the backbone of administration, becomes so rare that whole regions slip into centuries without leaving a single written record. Archaeologists call this the archaeological silence, a period where pottery regresses, settlement patterns shift unpredictably, and the once bustling urban centers shrink into villages scattered across crumbling infrastructure. The Roman roads remain, stretching across the land like ghostly arteries, but the flow of people, ideas, and commerce that once animated them slows to a trickle. A city that once held 40,000 citizens might dwindle to a few hundred. Aqueducts dry out, bathhouses decay, and in the absence of written continuity, the memories of how these systems worked fade until they become little more than strange, abandoned monuments of another world. What makes this transition unsettling is its unevenness. Some regions collapse almost immediately, plunging into what feels like total societal forgetting. Others manage to maintain fragments of Roman order for generations before the unraveling finally reaches them. Britain becomes a void, its cities abandoned, its pottery devolving into forms so primitive that archaeologists once believed different populations had replaced the Romanized inhabitants. In Italy, there is continuity, but reduced to embers. Cities shrink, but do not die, and literacy limps along just enough to preserve fragments of memory. In Gaul, small pockets cling to Roman customs, while surrounding territories transform into entirely different cultural landscapes. Chaos and continuity overlap in unpredictable patterns, making the period feel less like a single collapse and more like a continental amnesia spreading at different speeds across different lands. The most haunting aspect of this era is the disappearance of specialization. In Rome's prime, the empire's strength rested on an intricate hierarchy of professions: scribes, architects, engineers, surveyors, metallurgists, and tradesmen whose knowledge was passed through apprenticeships and preserved in documents. But once the system that depended on these specialists collapsed, the incentive to maintain their skills evaporated. A village of 200 people simply had no need for a full-time engineer or architect. They needed farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds. Technical knowledge, no matter how advanced, dies when no one has a reason to maintain it. And within a few generations, the ability to build multi-story structures, maintain stone bridges, or produce advanced concrete disappears entirely. The landscape fills with the skeletons of Roman achievements that no one remembers how to replicate. This is why historians call the period dark. Not because the people living through it were ignorant or primitive, but because the record, our window into their world, is nearly non-existent. The darkness lies in what we cannot see. Thousands of settlements appear in archaeological surveys, clusters of post holes, small farms, wooden structures that left no lasting mark. These communities lived, traded, raised children, buried their dead, adapted to their changing world, and yet they left behind almost nothing that can tell us who they were. No written laws, no trade records, no personal letters, just fragments of pottery and tools, enough to prove their existence but not enough to illuminate their lives. Yet from this darkness, patterns emerge that hint at a world still complex, still connected, still evolving in ways we don't fully understand. Metalworking continues in subtle but sophisticated forms. Burial sites reveal goods traded across hundreds of miles, suggesting networks of exchange more extensive than once believed. Isolated communities show surprising consistency in craftsmanship and design, meaning ideas were still spreading even if the records of those ideas were not. The puzzle is not that the world became simple, it's that its complexity left no trace of itself. And then, into this shadowed landscape, come the Norse. When Viking ships first appear on the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms in the late 8th century, they do not bring darkness, they bring exposure. They force the era's hidden fractures into view. Their raids and expeditions reveal that Europe is not divided into well-defined kingdoms, but into a patchwork of small polities, shifting alliances, and communities that barely resemble the Roman world that came before. Their voyages expose a remarkable truth. Even as Europe lost literacy, monumental architecture, and centralized governance, the oceanic world of the North maintained, and perhaps expanded, its knowledge of long-distance navigation, shipbuilding, and exploration. This creates a fascinating contrast. While the Mediterranean world forgot, the Norse remembered, but not in writing. Their knowledge lives in oral tradition, memorized through sagas, stories, chants, and navigational lore passed from master to apprentice. These sagas are not historical documents in the traditional sense. They blur fact and legend, compress centuries into narrative arcs, and allow mythic elements to sit comfortably beside real events. But underneath their embellishments lies evidence of logistical capabilities that rival anything the Roman world possessed. The Norse traveled from Scandinavia to North America, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, establishing trade routes that connected Europe to the Abbasid Caliphate. And yet, they left behind almost nothing written about how they were able to coordinate such vast undertakings. The Dark Ages, then, are not simply a period of decline, but a period of shifting skill sets, one where literacy weakens, but navigational memory strengthens, where engineering fades, but craftsmanship persists, where state structures crumble, but community bonds adapt in unique ways. The problem is that the systems that preserved knowledge in earlier eras, stone inscriptions, clay tablets, extensive bureaucracies, no longer exist. The knowledge survives through people, and when those people die without passing it on, entire intellectual lineages vanish. Monasteries become the final bastions of memory. Monks hunched over wooden desks, carefully copying manuscripts by candlelight, become the only reason we still have works by Aristotle, Virgil, Pliny, and dozens of other authors whose texts would otherwise have vanished. But even here, the preservation is selective. Manuscripts deemed unimportant or too pagan are scraped clean, a practice known as palimpsesting, so the parchment can be reused. The erased texts remain faintly visible beneath later writings, like ghosts trapped beneath the surface, whispering fragments of a world that might have been preserved if circumstances had been kinder. What makes this era so mysterious is not just what was lost, but how quickly it was forgotten. The collapse of literacy happens in less than 2 generations. A child raised in a Roman household might grow up reading letters scratched on wax tablets, listening to contract negotiations, and understanding the rhythms of bureaucratic governance. That child's grandchildren, living only a few decades later, might never see a written document, never hear Latin spoken fluently, never enter a stone building constructed by contemporary hands. A transformation this rapid suggests that the collapse was not merely political, it was psychological. When the systems that give meaning to a civilization fall away, people adapt by narrowing their world. Survival replaces ambition. Local replaces global. Memory contracts to the size of the village, then the household, then the family story. And yet beneath the ashes of forgotten cities and the silence of vanished texts, something persists, evidence of resilience. The Dark Ages are not simply a void. They are a crucible, a period in which old systems die and new ones quietly form. And while the written record cannot guide us, the patterns in architecture, trade goods, burial practices, and technological diffusion hint that these centuries were not empty, but full of transformations too subtle to fit into the historical narratives we have constructed. To see them clearly, we must step into the darkness with the understanding that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but a sign that history once again slipped out of sight, leaving us to reconstruct its outlines from the fragments it left behind. If Europe's forgotten centuries reveal how a civilization can lose itself from within, The pre-Columbian Americas show how an entire hemisphere can be erased from the global narrative in the span of a breath, not because its cultures were primitive or because they left no trace, but because the catastrophe that struck them happened with such speed and ferocity that memory itself shattered. What emerges from the soil, from the buried plazas and hidden earthworks, is a picture of societies as sophisticated, complex, and interconnected as any in the ancient world. And then a void where their stories should be. A silence not born of mystery alone, but of tragedy. Imagine standing atop Monk's Mound at Cahokia in the year 1100, a monumental platform of earth so vast that it rivals the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Below you spreads a city of perhaps 40,000 people, arranged in neighborhoods, plazas, ceremonial centers, and residential districts, all laid out according to astronomical alignments. The air carries the sound of flint tools shaping wood, the beating of drums during a communal rite, the creaking of canoes arriving from distant settlements. Traders carry copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rockies. Cahokia hums with the energy of a metropolis connected to regions thousands of miles apart. Yet when Europeans arrive centuries later, the city is gone, not ruined in war, not burned to ash, but emptied. Its population dispersed, its meaning swallowed by time so completely that local tribes no longer know who built it or why. This is not an isolated story. Across the Mississippi Valley, in what we call the Mississippian culture, dozens of cities rise and fall with a speed that suggests both rapid growth and sudden collapse. Moundville, Etowah, Spiro, each bears evidence of religious complexity, social hierarchy, and long-distance trade. Elaborate iconography carved into shell and copper hints at cosmologies as intricate as those of the Maya or the ancient Near East. But then, at different moments across the centuries, the cities fade. Some are abandoned. Others transform into smaller villages. The landscapes remain. Earthworks arranged in geometric patterns, platforms aligned to solstices, plazas where thousands once gathered. But the voices go quiet. Chaco Canyon presents an even stranger mystery. In the deserts of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans construct great houses, multi-story structures of masonry and timber, arranged with mathematical precision, some containing hundreds of rooms. Roads as straight as mathematical lines radiate outward, stretching for miles across the desert, linking Chaco to outlying settlements. Observatories built into cliff walls track lunar and solar cycles. The architecture suggests a centralized authority, a shared ceremonial purpose, and a society capable of organizing labor on an enormous scale. And then, somewhere around the mid-1100s, they leave. Not destroyed, not conquered. They simply walk away, abandoning the great houses and scattering into smaller communities. Their descendants survive, but the memory of why Chaco was built and why it was abandoned dissolves into oral tradition whose meanings are debated even today. The pattern repeats from the Great Plains to the Amazon basin, where LiDAR has revealed ancient cities hidden beneath the canopy. Settlements that once supported tens of thousands of people, interconnected networks of raised roads and agricultural fields engineered for flood control. These cities were thriving long before European contact, and many were deserted before Europeans ever laid eyes on them. Some were still occupied when disease arrived, disease that traveled faster than ships, spreading along trade routes and wiping out populations before any explorer set foot inland. By the time European chroniclers reached many of these regions, the civilizations that built them had already collapsed. The chroniclers saw empty land and assumed it had always been empty. This assumption becomes the foundation for centuries of misinterpretation. A continent that once held as many as 100 million people, cities, states, ceremonial centers, engineering feats, astronomically aligned monuments, is rewritten as a wilderness. The silence of depopulated landscapes is mistaken for a lack of history. Entire nations disappear so completely that later archaeologists must reconstruct them from shards of pottery, abandoned foundations, and the faint echoes preserved in oral tradition. But even without written records, the artifacts left behind speak of knowledge systems that challenge our assumptions about the Americas. Look at the Newark earthworks in Ohio, massive geometric enclosures spanning nearly 4 square miles, aligned with lunar events in ways that require precise astronomical knowledge. Look at the network of Hopewell trade routes, carrying mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from Yellowstone, and copper from the Great Lakes. These networks are not random. They suggest a shared cultural language, a symbolic system, and a worldview that connected societies across vast distances. The absence of writing does not imply the absence of complexity. It implies a different memory structure, one based on ritual, cosmology, and embodied knowledge. But embodied knowledge is fragile. When populations collapse, when families fracture, when communities disperse, the knowledge carried in stories, ceremonies, and oral lineages dissipates. The tragedy of the Americas is that the collapse was so rapid that memory had no time to adapt. Diseases like smallpox and measles, introduced unintentionally, strike with mortality rates so high that entire societies lose not only their people, but their storytellers, their spiritual leaders, their navigators, their artisans. Knowledge that had survived for centuries evaporates in a generation. The archaeological record shows this erasure with brutal clarity. Settlements abruptly end, pottery styles freeze or vanish, monument construction halts, the cultural vocabulary collapses, objects once imbued with meaning become mute because no one remains to explain them. In some regions, the population drop is so severe that newcomers resettle lands without any understanding of the civilizations that came before. This is how legends form, when fact and myth fuse into narratives too incomplete to verify. And yet, scattered across the hemisphere, fragments of continuity survive. Indigenous communities maintain oral histories that recall migrations, floods, star knowledge, ancestral places, and sacred landscapes. These stories often align with archaeological findings in ways that suggest deeper truths, memories preserved not through writing, but through ritual and repetition. The challenge is that centuries of disruption, forced relocation, and colonial pressure have obscured many of these traditions. Some stories survive only as faint outlines. Others persist vividly, but have no surviving material evidence to anchor them. What we see in the archaeological record, therefore, is only the visible portion of a much larger cultural iceberg. The silence surrounding the Americas before European arrival is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of interrupted memory. It invites us to rethink not only how civilizations rise and fall, but how knowledge survives, or fails to survive, catastrophe. If a society of tens of thousands can vanish so thoroughly that its name, language, and origin myths are lost, then what does that say about the stability of human memory? If monumental cities can be mistaken for natural formations, if entire cosmologies can fade without a trace, then how many other civilizations might have risen and fallen across the world long before recorded history began? This question forces us to confront a possibility that unsettles traditional historical models. That human civilization may be older, more cyclic, and more prone to erasure than we assume. The pre-Columbian Americas offer not just a lesson in what was lost, but a mirror reflecting the fragility of our own moment. They remind us that the record we inherit is not the whole story, only the story that survived long enough to be written down. And beyond the edges of that record lie worlds of meaning, accomplishment, and complexity that disappeared before they had a chance to defend themselves against oblivion. In the end, the greatest mystery of the Americas is not how their civilizations rose, nor how they fell, but how close we came to never discovering they existed at all. What else, hidden beneath forests, rivers, deserts, or layers of time, waits to be rediscovered? And how many stories have slipped beyond recovery, leaving only faint impressions in the earth? Silent reminders that the past is far larger than the version we tell ourselves. If the forgotten civilizations of the Americas show how a continent's memory can vanish, the Indus Valley reveals how a civilization can remain visible, its cities intact, its artifacts preserved, and yet remain utterly unreadable. It is a silence of a different kind, not born from destruction, but from a gap in understanding so profound that it fragments the story of humanity itself. Walk through the excavated streets of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, and you are surrounded not by ruins of chaos, but by the deliberate imprint of a world that knew exactly what it was doing. Straight streets intersect at right angles. Brick dimensions follow a standardized ratio across hundreds of miles. Drainage systems run beneath sidewalks like veins beneath skin. Wells appear in nearly every household, offering fresh water just steps from the door. Everything speaks of order, yet everything withholds its voice. What makes the enigma of the Indus Valley so haunting is that it shows us the skeleton of a civilization without revealing its soul. Other ancient cultures carved their names into stone, wrote epics, documented laws, and left behind narratives that transform ruins into stories. But the Harappans left texts so short, so symbolically compact, that we cannot decipher them. More than 4,000 inscribed objects exist today. Seals, tablets, pottery shards, bearing a script that hints at meaning but never reveals it. A handful of symbols repeat, sometimes alongside animals like bulls, goats, or mythical creatures. But the inscriptions are brief, rarely longer than a dozen characters, too clipped to establish syntax or grammar. They sit like labels without context, fragments of a language that refuses to speak. Because of this, we cannot identify their rulers. We cannot reconstruct their myths. We cannot trace their dynasties or understand their laws. We do not know whether their societies were governed by kings, councils, priests, merchants, or something entirely unfamiliar. We do not know whether their religious practices resembled the proto-Hindu ideas later found in the region, or whether they belonged to a tradition lost to time. The uniformity of their architecture suggests central planning. The lack of grand palaces suggests egalitarianism. The presence of the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro suggests ritual purification. The absence of monumental temples challenges our assumptions about ancient spirituality. The result is a civilization so carefully built, so meticulously structured, and yet so cryptically silent that it feels less like a missing chapter of history and more like a book written in a code we have not yet evolved to read. Standardization is perhaps the clearest thread we can grasp. Across the Indus domain, an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, brick sizes follow the same 1:4 ratio. This consistency implies not only communication between cities, but shared cultural or administrative norms. Their weights and measures follow decimal and binary systems with astonishing precision, suggesting a commercial network regulated with mathematical sophistication. Such uniformity hints at an intelligent bureaucracy or a deeply ingrained cultural expectation of order. But without texts, we cannot tell which interpretation holds true. We see the infrastructure, we do not see the ideology behind it. Even their urban planning challenges us. Other Bronze Age civilizations grew organically around religious centers or ruling elites. The Indus cities seem designed, planned from the ground up. Streets divide neatly into blocks. Homes include bathing areas, courtyards, and access to communal drainage. Some buildings appear elevated, possibly functioning as administrative hubs. But again, the purpose remains speculative. We cannot read a single Harappan document explaining why the city was laid out this way, what beliefs guided its design, or how decisions were made. Then comes the greatest silence of all: the disappearance. Around 1900 BCE, the Harappan world begins to change. Construction quality decreases. Settlements splinter into smaller villages. Long-distance trade with Mesopotamia fades. Some rivers shift course, particularly the Ghaggar Hakra, which may have once been the legendary Sarasvati mentioned in later Indian texts. Climate patterns shift, the monsoon weakens, agriculture becomes harder. Over centuries, not days, not years, but generations, the civilization dissolves, not violently, not suddenly, but inevitably, like a tide receding from the shore. What is strange is how complete the forgetting becomes. When the Vedic peoples arrive, their oral traditions, later written as the Rig Veda, speak of battles, migrations, rituals, and cosmic hymns. But they make no explicit mention of the great brick cities that had dominated the region for millennia. No legends of lost metropolises, no stories of abandoned baths, no myths about the people who built straight roads and engineered drains with such precision. It is as if the memory of the Harappans disappeared so thoroughly that even poetry could not hold on to it. This absence raises unsettling possibilities. Did the Vedic peoples simply not encounter the ruins? Did they see them but not understand them? Or did the physical remains erode faster than we imagine, leaving little for early migrants to interpret? Whatever the reason, the Indus civilization vanishes not only from its own history, but from the historical memory of the cultures that followed. Its silence becomes generational, a forgetting so thorough that archaeologists in the 1920s had to rediscover it by accident. And yet, the deeper we study the Indus remains, the more questions surface. Why are there so few clear signs of warfare? Why are graves so rare compared to other ancient societies? Why are there no massive temples or palaces? Why do so many seals depict animals rather than rulers? Why does the script remain so short? Why would a civilization so advanced leave no long inscriptions, No monumental texts carved into stone? One theory suggests the writing was not used for narrative purposes, but for administrative tagging. Ownership marks, trade indicators, ritual labels. If so, their full literary tradition might have existed on perishable materials, palm leaves, birch bark, textiles, that decayed over millennia. Another theory proposes that their governing structure was decentralized, a network of culturally aligned but politically independent city-states, each adhering to shared standards but not ruled by a single monarch. Still others see the uniformity of artifacts and architecture as evidence of a cohesive ideology, perhaps spiritual or cultural rather than political, that guided daily life. A worldview in which order, cleanliness, and standardization were expressions of harmony, a principle embedded so deeply that it shaped everything from brick size to city layout. The greatest challenge is that every interpretation, no matter how well supported, feels incomplete. The Harappans gave us the evidence of their achievements, but not the explanations. Their world is visible yet concealed, tangible yet enigmatic. It forces us to confront the limitations of archaeology when no surviving narrative exists to anchor interpretation. Even modern technology, AI analysis, statistical models, machine learning, struggles to break open the code. Algorithms detect patterns that mimic linguistic behavior, suggesting the script may represent language. Others argue the inscriptions function more like emblems or symbolic tags. Without longer texts, the debate remains unresolved. The script lies just beyond understanding, like a whisper at the edge of comprehension. In the end, the Indus Valley civilization stands as a paradox. It is one of the largest, most sophisticated cultures of the ancient world, yet one of the least understood. Its silence is not the silence of absence, but of withheld meaning. It reminds us that even when ruins survive, even when artifacts endure, history can still slip away if the key to interpreting it is lost. And so we are left staring at orderly streets, baked brick houses, symmetrical waits, graceful seals, and long, dry baths, sensing intelligence behind every design, but unable to hear the voices that once filled these spaces. It is a world preserved in clay and stone, yet unanchored by story. A civilization whose legacy is not a tale we can read, but a question we are still learning how to ask. If the Indus Valley feels like a civilization preserved in amber yet mute, then Africa's lost kingdoms show us something even more disquieting. Histories that were not merely forgotten by time, but actively erased. Histories that survived for centuries through memory, lineage, song, and ceremony, only to be dismissed, overwritten, or destroyed by those who arrived later and believed that anything impressive must have been built by someone else. In Africa, the gaps in history are not empty. They are filled with the echoes of voices silenced by conquest, colonization, and the arrogance of assuming that written archives reflect the totality of human achievement. What survives beneath that erasure reveals sophisticated cultures whose stories were severed from their descendants, leaving the modern world with fragments instead of full narratives. Great Zimbabwe stands as one of the clearest examples, a sprawling complex of stone walls rising in elegant curves across the southeastern African landscape, built entirely without mortar. The craftsmanship is unmistakable. Blocks of granite fitted with such precision that the walls curve and ripple like stone woven into fabric. At its height, around 1300 CE, This was not an isolated settlement. It was the capital of a flourishing kingdom that controlled the gold routes linking the interior of Africa to the Swahili coast. Tens of thousands lived within its sphere. Its trade goods reached China, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. And yet when Europeans first encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans had built them. They invented stories of Phoenicians, lost Israelites, or mythical outsiders, any explanation except the people whose ancestors still lived nearby. This denial was not an innocent misunderstanding. It was purposeful historical distortion. By insisting Great Zimbabwe must have been built by foreigners, colonial officials could claim the land had once belonged to outsiders, and therefore not to the people they were displacing. Oral histories that might have explained the site were ignored or suppressed. Artifacts were looted. Excavations were conducted not to discover truth, but to prove a predetermined narrative. As a result, the civilization that built Great Zimbabwe, its rulers, its engineers, its cultural logic, remains partly obscured. We can map the walls, analyze the stonework, trace trade routes, and reconstruct economic patterns, but the internal narrative, the lived experience, the dynastic stories, the spiritual frameworks, was severed before scholars had the chance to preserve it. The Kingdom of Kush offers another window into Africa's silenced past. For 1,000 years, Kush maintained a powerful civilization along the Nile, at times rivaling and even conquering Egypt. Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty ruled from Nubia, bringing their own traditions into the heart of Egyptian statecraft. Their pyramids, steeper, more numerous, dot the desert in silent clusters. Their artisans developed distinctive iconography, their scribes wrote in Meroitic script, and their diplomatic networks spanned continents. Yet today, the script of Kush remains largely undeciphered. We can identify names, titles, a handful of words, but not meaning. Entire histories, wars, treaties, religious beliefs, cosmological ideas remain locked inside inscriptions we cannot yet read. This is not because the Kushites lacked complexity. Their writing appears on monuments, pottery, stelae, administrative objects. It suggests a literate culture with bureaucratic layers similar to Egypt's. But when the kingdom fell, literacy vanished with it. The scribes who knew the symbols did not survive to teach them. No bilingual Rosetta Stone has yet been found. And as centuries passed, the oral traditions that might have preserved meaning became fragmented, reshaped by later cultures, or lost entirely. We are left with the ruins of cities, the outlines of pyramids, the faint traces of royal cemeteries, physical evidence without narrative context. Even more enigmatic is the Nok culture of West Africa. Emerging around 1500 BCE, flourishing for nearly a millennium, the Nok created terracotta sculptures of extraordinary detail. Stylized human faces, elaborate hairstyles, expressive eyes that seem to watch you across 3,000 years. But their artistry is not their only mystery. The Nok appear to have mastered ironworking by around 1000 BCE, centuries before much of the world transitioned out of the Bronze Age. Yet they left no writing, no monuments with inscriptions, no architectural complexes that could reveal their political structure. Their settlements are known mostly through scattered debris fields. Their sculptures survive because they were buried, often by accident, sometimes by erosion, not because they were preserved deliberately. And without written records, we cannot trace how ironworking spread, how their society was organized, or why their culture eventually faded. we see innovation without biography. Across West Africa, medieval empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai once commanded vast territories and accumulated wealth that astonished even the seasoned chroniclers of the Islamic world. Caravans crossed the Sahara carrying salt, gold, and knowledge. Cities like Timbuktu flourished as centers of scholarship, housing libraries of manuscripts that recorded philosophy, astronomy, law, poetry, and medicine. Yet these manuscripts survived only because they were written in Arabic, a language connected to a transcontinental tradition of preservation. The indigenous languages of these empires left far fewer written traces. Even when oral traditions survived, they were often dismissed by outsiders as folklore rather than historiography. Colonialism compounded the loss. Ancient cities were abandoned or looted. Artifacts were removed to foreign museums. Libraries were burned, sometimes deliberately, to sever cultural identity. Mission schools taught African children that their ancestors had no history worth remembering. Knowledge keepers, griots, sages, storytellers were marginalized or ignored. And so the continuity that might have allowed modern scholars to reconstruct African antiquity was fractured. Today, archaeologists and historians work to recover what was buried or disregarded, but they do so against a backdrop of intentional forgetting. Yet, despite this erasure, the fragments that remain reveal a continent whose history was far more interconnected, dynamic, and innovative than previously acknowledged. In southern Africa, evidence shows widespread trade networks extending across thousands of miles, linking inland communities to coastal merchants who traded with Arabia, India, and China. In West Africa, ancient urban centers like Gene suggest a model of city organization not dependent on kingship or monumental architecture, but on distributed authority and shared civic identity. In East Africa, Swahili city-states emerge not as colonial hybrids, but as sophisticated maritime cultures blending African and Indian Ocean traditions long before the arrival of Europeans. Much of what colonial narratives labeled as primitive is now recognized as strategically adapted to environment and trade. Mud brick settlements reflect not a lack of engineering, but an architecture suited to seasonal flooding. Oral histories encode genealogies and migrations with remarkable accuracy. Terraced agriculture in Ethiopia demonstrates mastery of water conservation. Metallurgy in West Africa shows independent innovation rather than diffusion. Every discovery forces us to revise earlier assumptions. But perhaps the most striking revelation is that Africa's lost history may not be lost at all, only untranslated. Beneath the surface-level silence lies a wealth of information encoded in material culture, linguistic patterns, oral traditions, ritual practices, and ecological adaptations. Each site excavated, each inscription analyzed, each story recorded adds another thread to the tapestry. Slowly, painstakingly, the fabric of Africa's ancient past is being rewoven. The tragedy is not that the history was never there. The tragedy is that for centuries the world refused to see it. And the deeper we dig, into the soil, into the archives, into the memories of communities whose traditions survived despite every attempt to extinguish them, the more we realize how much remains undiscovered. The story of Africa is not a void. It is a mosaic with missing tiles, a text with pages torn out but margins still whispering clues. In this lies a broader lesson. Civilizations do not vanish only through collapse. They can also be buried beneath narratives imposed by outsiders, obscured by prejudice, or overshadowed by foreign interpretations. To understand Africa's lost centuries is to confront the power of erasure, to see how history is shaped not just by what happened, but by who chooses to remember it. And as we recover these stories piece by piece, we begin to glimpse a truth larger than any single kingdom, that the human past is deeper, richer, and more interconnected than the written record alone could ever reveal. If Africa's buried histories reveal how civilizations can be hidden in plain sight, then the Pacific, vast, glittering, and deceptively empty, reveals how human brilliance can travel thousands of miles yet leave barely a trace. Here, across tens of millions of square miles of open ocean, scattered over islands no larger than a pin on a map, lies one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements, the Polynesian expansion. For centuries, these ocean navigators crossed distances that rivaled the journeys of early spacecraft, guided not by compasses or charts, but by memory, intuition, star paths, wave patterns, and an embodied knowledge so refined that it borders on the supernatural. And yet, despite its magnitude, the story of how an entire ocean was explored and settled remains frustratingly incomplete, elusive as the currents that carried those ancient voyagers eastward. Imagine looking out from a beach on a small island in the central Pacific more than 1,000 years ago. There is no horizon dotted with neighboring lands. There are no mountain silhouettes rising from distant shores. There is only water, endless, shimmering, hostile to the unprepared. Yet Polynesian navigators set out across this ocean with confidence so absolute that it defies modern assumptions about prehistoric limitations. They reached Hawaii, more than 2,500 miles from Tahiti. They reached New Zealand, another 2,400 miles south. They reached Easter Island, one of the most isolated land masses on Earth. They even reached South America, as evidenced by the presence of the sweet potato, a South American plant, in Polynesia centuries before European contact. The question is not whether they did it. The question is how, and how much of that knowledge has vanished. Traditional Polynesian navigation relies on a mental map of astonishing complexity. Navigators memorize the rising and setting positions of hundreds of stars, each star a directional anchor. They read swells created by storms thousands of miles away, distinguishing intersecting wave patterns the way a musician distinguishes overlapping notes. They watch for reflective glimmers beneath clouds, indicating shallow lagoons just below the horizon's curve. They interpret bird flight, wind shifts, even the behavior of bioluminescent organisms. These methods form a navigation system that does not require tools because the navigator becomes the tool, trained to read an environment with a level of sensitivity that modern sailors, armed with satellites, rarely achieve. But this system also depends on cultural continuity. Knowledge is passed from master to apprentice through story, ritual, repetition, and lived experience. It does not survive if communities fragment, if voyages cease, if colonization disrupts lineages. By the time Europeans arrived in the Pacific in the 1500s and 1600s, large-scale voyaging had already waned. Many islands had become self-contained. The old routes had grown dormant. And the master navigators, the ones who might have explained how the Pacific had been conquered, were fewer, their traditions fading as generations shifted from exploration to settlement. As a result, the reconstruction of ancient Polynesian navigation relies on fragments, oral accounts preserved on a handful of islands, archaeological evidence of settlement patterns, and experimental voyages conducted by modern navigators who revived the practice with guidance from the last traditional masters. But even with these sources, the full scope of the Polynesian expansion remains partially obscured. We can trace settlement dates, identify cultural similarities, and map linguistic relationships, yet the specific decision-making processes that guided each migration, the why, the how, the rituals behind choosing a direction, remain blurred by time. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, embodies this mystery with almost theatrical intensity. Its massive stone moai stand like sentinels facing inland, their expressions frozen in a timeless vigil. Popular narratives claim the islanders destroyed their environment, cutting down their forests, triggering collapse and conflict. But emerging evidence paints a different picture, one where the island's transformation was shaped not just by human behavior, but by ecological fragility, invasive species, and later European interventions that devastated the population. The traditional story of self-inflicted ruin oversimplifies a far more complex reality. For centuries, Rapa Nui thrived, constructing over 800 moai and developing a unique script known as Rongo Rongo, one of the very few independent writing systems ever created. Yet we cannot read it. The tablets containing the script were largely destroyed or lost during the upheaval of European contact, and the surviving examples are too few to decipher. Like the Indus script or the writing of ancient Kush, Rongo Rongo sits tantalizingly close to revelation, yet locked behind a barrier of missing context. What histories, genealogies, or cosmologies were once written on palmwood tablets now reduced to museum curiosities? What story of the moai's purpose, spiritual, political, astronomical, was once recorded in symbols no one alive understands? Rongo Rongo is not the only puzzle. The engineering behind the moai's construction and transport remains debated. Oral tradition suggests the statues walked, meaning they were rocked forward using ropes and coordinated teams. Experiments show this method is plausible, but the broader logistical framework, the social structures, the ceremonial significance, the resource allocation, remains only partially visible. Without written accounts, we infer meaning from material remains, but the narrative lacks a first-person voice. Meanwhile, across the Western Pacific, another marvel rises from the sea. Nan Madol, a city of artificial islands built from massive basalt columns, arranged with geometric precision, connected by canals, and aligned to celestial markers. Some columns weigh 50 tons, yet were transported without wheels or pack animals. The site's construction, beginning around 1200 CE, required planning, authority, and engineering capabilities that leave archaeologists awestruck. But when Europeans arrived, Nan Madol was abandoned. Local oral accounts echoed the memory of a ruling dynasty displaced by conflict, but the details, the administrative structure, the rituals performed in its ceremonial centers, the reasons behind its decline, remained faint, worn thin by the passage of generations. What connects these Pacific mysteries is not merely their isolation, but the fragility of the memory systems that sustained them. In societies where knowledge travels through speech, performance, and apprenticeship rather than stone inscriptions, historical continuity depends entirely on human survival and cultural stability. When population loss, forced relocation, or traumatic upheaval disrupts that continuity, entire bodies of knowledge can vanish without leaving textual traces. Yet the Pacific also shows us something extraordinary, that memory preserved in the body, in movement, rhythm, sensory attunement, can achieve feats we often attribute only to literate civilizations. Navigation without maps, architecture without metal tools, astronomy without written charts, governance without monumental archives. These cultures remind us that literacy is only one way of preserving knowledge. Not the only way, not the oldest way, and not always the most resilient way. But the Pacific story also raises deeper questions about the nature of human achievement. How many other seafaring cultures might have risen and fallen before recorded history, leaving behind no trace because their vessels were made of wood and their settlements of perishable materials? How many oceanic corridors, now deep beneath rising seas, once supported island-hopping networks lost to time? If Polynesians could cross the Pacific with memory alone, what might earlier cultures have accomplished, unrecognized because their tools did not fossilize? In the end, the Pacific's lost histories are not simply a testament to what has vanished, but a challenge to our assumptions. They ask us to reconsider what constitutes evidence, what counts as civilization, and how many achievements humanity may have forgotten because they left no stone monuments or written records. They remind us that oceans are not barriers but bridges, and that the greatest voyages in human history may be the ones whose stories were never written down. If the Pacific teaches us that human achievement can thrive without writing, then the murky millennia before ancient Egypt emerged teach us something even stranger. That entire eras of innovation, experimentation, and cultural development can disappear so thoroughly that their traces feel accidental. Egypt, with its pyramids, hieroglyphs, and monumental temples, appears in textbooks as a sudden flowering, a civilization that seems to leap from simple farming villages to megalithic engineering in what looks like a single stride. But the real darkness lies in the centuries before Egypt became Egypt, an era so poorly understood that it feels less like a missing chapter and more like a missing book. These are the forgotten centuries of the Nile, a long, enigmatic prelude to one of humanity's most iconic civilizations, buried beneath layers of sand, silt, and selective memory. The Egyptians who built the pyramids around 2500 BCE possessed advanced mathematics, complex religious symbolism, astronomical alignment techniques, and social organization capable of mobilizing tens of thousands. Yet the archaeological record leading up to this achievement is startlingly thin. We see scattered artifacts from the Badarian and Nakada cultures, pottery, figurines, burial goods, but these fragments do not fully explain how a society leaps from small, semi-nomadic communities to constructing architectural feats so precise that modern engineers still debate their methods. Somewhere in that transition lies a period of innovation so dramatic that it should have left a far richer imprint than what survives. Part of the mystery comes from the Nile itself. Its annual floods deposited layers of fertile silt across the floodplain, creating ideal farmland. But those same floods also buried, eroded, or dissolved countless early settlements. Mud brick houses dissolve quickly in floodplains, wooden structures vanish, cemeteries shift as the river changes course. Most early Egyptian habitation sites simply did not survive long enough to be discovered. What remains are the more durable clues: stone tools, pottery shards, isolated graves. These fragments sketch an outline but cannot fill the narrative. Yet even these fragments raise questions. In Nakada graves dating centuries before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, we find intricate cosmetic palettes shaped like animals, meticulously carved ivory combs, copper tools, and pottery painted with motifs of boats, deities, and processions. These images suggest a cosmology already forming, symbols of power, ritual, and mythology that appear long before formal writing emerges. The presence of boats, especially, hints at trade networks along the Nile and perhaps even across the Red Sea. Some artifacts appear to contain influences from the Levant, Nubia, and possibly regions farther south. Whatever was happening in pre-dynastic Egypt, it was not isolation. It was exchange, movement, and symbolic development on a scale far wider than simple agrarian life would suggest. One of the most enigmatic symbols from this period is the so-called Gertzian knife handles, carved with scenes of animals, warriors, and rulers using iconography that foreshadows the later pharaonic worldview. These carvings imply hierarchy, ritual authority, and perhaps early kingship long before Egypt's first dynasty. But without written records, we do not know the names of these proto-rulers, the extent of their influence, or how their authority transitioned into the unification under Narmer, the legendary king whose palette depicts the symbolic merging of Upper and Lower Egypt. The Narmer palette itself raises even more questions. Discovered in Hierakonpolis, it shows artistic sophistication, political symbolism, and ideological clarity that do not align with the sparse archaeological record preceding it. How does such a well-defined state ideology appear so fully formed? What forms of proto-writing, record-keeping, or ceremonial tradition existed before the hieroglyphic system crystallized? Some scholars propose that an earlier script may have existed, perhaps used on perishable materials. Others speculate that regional chieftains maintained oral genealogies and symbolic traditions that later became codified into dynastic narratives. But speculation remains all we have. Even more puzzling is the emergence of monumental architecture. Before the pyramids, Egypt's earliest stone structures appear in the form of mastabas, rectangular tombs built with mud brick and stone. Yet mastabas themselves appear suddenly, without a clear architectural evolution. One generation builds modest graves. The next builds vast rectangular monuments, and only a few generations later, the step pyramid of Djoser rises at Saqqara, designed by Imhotep, a figure so advanced in knowledge that later Egyptians deified him as a god of wisdom and healing. The step pyramid marks a leap so dramatic that it feels like a technological frontier crossed in a short burst of innovation. Where did that knowledge come from? Was it accumulated slowly in a record we cannot see? Or did it emerge from experimentation that left no durable traces? The questions deepen when we examine the alignment of the pyramids, particularly the Great Pyramid of Giza, whose precision in orientation, proportions, and internal geometry suggests mathematical knowledge not preserved in surviving texts. If this knowledge existed, where did the learning happen? Who were the early mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers? Their names are lost, their workshops lost, their manuscripts lost, if they ever existed outside oral tradition. This obscurity is not limited to architecture. Early religious beliefs appear in burial goods, iconography, and figurines, but we lack the texts that would explain the logic behind these symbols. Deities like Hathor, Min, and Horus appear in pre-dynastic art, yet the stories that shaped these gods are missing. It is as if we opened a book in the middle, reading the myths of Egypt without knowing their origins. Later, Egyptians claimed their civilization extended back thousands of years into a Zep Tepi, a mythical first time when gods ruled the earth. These legends may be symbolic, but they speak to the cultural memory of something older, something foundational that even the Egyptians themselves viewed as ancient. Here lies the deeper mystery. What preceded Egypt's recorded history was not a blank slate, but a fading memory even to the people who built pyramids. They looked back and saw shadows of earlier eras, cycles of development, collapse, migration, innovation that did not survive in written form. Their mythology may preserve echoes of these forgotten epochs, disguised as divine narratives of creation, kingship, and cosmic order. But the question extends beyond Egypt. Around the same periods, we see sudden leaps in complexity in other regions: megalithic structures in Europe, early city formations in Mesopotamia, enigmatic stone circles in the Sahara, and long-lost river cultures in Sudan. These simultaneous bursts of complexity suggest networked knowledge, migrations, or environmental pressures that encouraged rapid technological and social transformation. And yet, the physical record for these developments is sporadic. Climate shifts bury evidence, rivers change course, floodplains erase settlements, and over thousands of years, wind and sand consume the traces of human habitation. Even when archaeology uncovers fragments, they rarely provide a continuous narrative. We see flashes, moments of brilliance, but the connecting threads disintegrate. Imagine if the only surviving traces of the modern world were a handful of tools, a fragmented tablet screen, a section of a highway, and 2 ruined skyscrapers. How would archaeologists reconstruct the complexity that produced them? That is the predicament we face when studying the pre-dynastic world. The evidence is insufficient not because the past was simple, but because the remnants of complexity decay faster than the achievements themselves. This era reminds us that civilizations do not spring into existence fully formed. They grow in layers, layers that can vanish. They develop across centuries, centuries that can be forgotten. And they depend on fragile systems of memory, systems that can collapse or shift into myth when the written word has not yet anchored them into permanence. What we call the beginning of Egyptian history may in fact be the midpoint of a much older story. A story whose prologue has been lost not through catastrophe alone, but through the quiet, inexorable erosion of time. The sands of the Nile are both preservers and destroyers, hiding as much as they reveal. And somewhere beneath those sands may lie the answer to one of the most profound questions in archaeology. How many civilizations rose and fell before the first dynasty recorded its triumphs in stone? Until we uncover more, the centuries before the pharaohs will remain a dimly lit corridor, its walls covered in symbols we cannot fully interpret, its entrance obscured, its exit uncertain, hinting that the origins of civilization may be far older, far broader, and far stranger than our written history admits. If the shadowy prelude to ancient Egypt forces us to confront how easily early complexity can vanish, then the deep prehistory of Europe reveals something even more disorienting: a landscape shaped by cultures whose achievements are monumental, precise, and symbolically rich, yet whose identities remain almost completely unknown. Europe's stone circles, long barrows, passage tombs, and megalithic alignments stand in fields, forests, and wind-swept plains like silent witnesses to a forgotten era. We know they were built with purpose. We know they required engineering knowledge, astronomical awareness, and social coordination. But we do not know the names, languages, myths, or political structures of the people who built them. Their civilizations are visible in stone, yet invisible in story. They are present in physical form, but absent from historical memory, as if time itself conspired to preserve the monuments and erase the makers. Consider Stonehenge, not as a lone structure, but as the centerpiece of a vast ritual landscape. Ditches, avenues, burial mounds, wooden henges, and processional pathways surround it for miles. Recent excavations reveal that Stonehenge was not a single construction, but a project spanning centuries, involving phases of rebuilding, reorientation, and cultural shifts. At its height, it functioned as part of a ceremonial corridor linking Durrington Walls, the River Avon, and the stone circle itself. This was not the work of isolated tribes. It required a social system capable of mobilizing thousands of people, feeding them, organizing them, and maintaining tradition across generations. Yet we have no record of who these people were. The builders left no writing, no inscriptions, no mythological accounts etched in stone. What survives are bones, tools, and a handful of artifacts, evidence of feasting, long-distance migration, and seasonal gatherings. Isotope analysis shows that some cattle consumed at Durrington Walls came from as far as Scotland, suggesting pilgrimage networks spanning hundreds of miles. But why did they come? What ceremonies were performed? What beliefs animated the monumental alignments, the solstice alignments, the relationships between stone, sky, and shadow? We do not know. The symbols were carved into memory, not into stone, and memory did not survive. Yet Europe's megalithic world extends far beyond Stonehenge. In Ireland, Newgrange rises from the earth like a glowing mound of ancient knowledge. The passage tomb's interior is aligned so precisely with the winter solstice sunrise that a beam of light enters the chamber for only a few minutes each year. This phenomenon required astronomical observation and architectural planning far beyond the capabilities of small, loosely organized communities. But again, the builders left no writing. Their art, spirals, zigzags, concentric circles, suggests symbolic systems, possibly cosmological, but without explanation. We can analyze the geometry, but not the meaning. Across Brittany, thousands of standing stones stretch across the land in long, mysterious rows at Karnak. Some align with celestial events. Others form enclosures or clusters whose purpose remains frustratingly elusive. In Malta, the Gantija temples predate the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge, featuring apses, altars, and elaborate stone architecture that suggests a complex ritual life. In the Orkney Islands, the Ness of Brodgar reveals a ceremonial complex once painted in vibrant colors, its walls engraved with symbolic patterns. The scale of construction challenges assumptions about Neolithic societies. These were not scattered farmers building simple huts. They organized labor for grand projects that required vision and shared belief. Yet for all their achievements, their voices are gone. Why? partly because writing had not yet been adopted in Europe. But writing alone does not determine memory. Oral traditions can preserve complex histories for thousands of years if communities remain intact. The problem is that Europe experienced waves of migration, cultural shifts, and societal transformations that did not simply overwrite earlier narratives. They obliterated them. The arrival of Indo-European-speaking peoples brought new languages, mythologies, and social structures. These newcomers either absorbed or displaced earlier cultures, leaving scant continuity between the megalith builders and later European societies. As centuries passed, new layers of identity formed. Mycenaeans, Celts, Romans, Germanic tribes all left their own stories, their own monuments, their own myths. The older memories faded. Megaliths became mysterious landmarks in folk tales, associated with giants, witches, or supernatural events, rather than remembered as the achievements of ancestors. The symbolic knowledge encoded in their architecture disappeared. The myths that once explained their purpose dissolved into the soil. Yet archaeology reveals something startling. The megalithic cultures of Europe were not isolated or primitive. They were connected by shared ideas. Alignments of tombs across Ireland, Britain, and France show similar design principles. Artistic motifs spread across thousands of miles. Genetic evidence reveals long-distance movement of individuals, including craft specialists and possibly ritual leaders. The exchange of obsidian, flint, and precious materials suggests networks of trade and communication that rival early Near Eastern systems. Still, the greatest mystery remains the suddenness with which megalithic building stopped. Across much of Europe, monumental construction declines dramatically around 2500 BCE. Stone circles, passage tombs, and long barrows cease. In their place emerge new burial practices, new pottery styles, and new settlement patterns associated with the bell beaker culture and other groups. This transition marks one of the most significant cultural transformations in European prehistory, but it is almost entirely unrecorded. We see the before. We see the after. The transition itself remains invisible. What caused the shift? Climate change? Disease? Migration? Social collapse? The evidence is ambiguous. Some regions show violent conflict, others show peaceful integration. Some megalithic sites appear to have been deliberately abandoned or ritually closed. Others simply fall out of use. The most plausible explanation is that Europe experienced a demographic and cultural shift that fundamentally changed its symbolic and political structures. New groups brought new values, and the old monumental traditions no longer fit the emerging worldview. This pattern raises an unsettling realization. Europe's prehistory is not a clear progression from simple to complex, but a sequence of rises and falls, each leaving incomplete traces. The megalith builders were not the first complex societies in Europe, nor the last. Yet they stand at a crucial intersection where the ability to create large-scale monuments existed without the parallel development of writing. It was a world of immense knowledge carried entirely through speech, ritual, and apprenticeship. Such systems are powerful, but fragile. When societies reliant on oral knowledge experience upheaval, their memories do not gradually fade. They disappear. The stories that connected people to monuments vanish. The meanings behind symbols evaporate. What remains is stone without interpretation, structure without narrative, achievement without identity. And so when we walk among Europe's ancient monuments today, when we trace spirals carved into stone, stand within circular arrangements aligned to solstices, or peer into passage tombs illuminated only once a year, we sense the presence of a world-view we no longer understand. We feel the echo of ceremonies, the gravity of ancestral authority, the pulse of a symbolic universe built around cycles of light and darkness, life and death, earth and sky. But the people who lived within that universe are ghosts. Their names, beliefs, languages, genealogies, all lost. Their monuments endure not because they were meant to last forever, but because stone survives where memory does not. In the end, Europe's forgotten builders remind us that civilization is not defined by writing alone. It is defined by intention, coordination, belief, and the ability to shape the environment in ways that outlast the moment. The megaliths stand as a testament to human imagination unleashed long before history began recording itself. They whisper of a world where knowledge was lived, not written, where meaning moved through ritual, not text, and of a past far deeper, stranger, and more layered than the linear narrative we inherited. And somewhere beneath that silence lies the truth that Europe, like every region on Earth, has seen civilizations rise, transform, and vanish long before they had the chance to leave written stories behind. If Europe's megalithic world reveals how a civilization can leave monuments without stories, then the deep history of Asia reveals something equally perplexing: how entire technological revolutions, cultural networks, and urban systems can emerge, flourish, and collapse with almost no surviving narrative to explain them. Across the vast landscapes of Central and East Asia, from the wind-swept steppes to the lush river valleys, the archaeological record suggests not a linear progression, but a pulsating rhythm. Civilizations rising in brilliant flashes of innovation, then scattering into silence. Some left ruins, others left only hints in genetic traces, trade goods, and linguistic echoes. And yet, these forgotten worlds shaped the foundations of later empires, technologies, and philosophies more profoundly than the surviving texts suggest. One of the clearest examples is the mysterious Liangzhu culture of Neolithic China. Flourishing around 3300–2300 BCE in the Yangtze River Delta, Liangzhu built complex water management systems, canals, levees, dams, that rival those of early Mesopotamia. Their jade craftsmanship reached a level of refinement unmatched anywhere else in the world at the time. Jade Kong and Bi discs, carved with meticulous precision, hint at cosmological beliefs centered on heaven, earth, and ancestral authority. Their settlements reveal social stratification, specialized labor, and long-distance trade. Yet despite their sophistication, Liangzhu left no writing. Whatever their beliefs, political structures, or historical narratives were, they dissolved when the culture collapsed, likely due to catastrophic flooding. What remains is a glimpse of an advanced society, erased almost entirely by shifting rivers. Farther north, in the grasslands and oases of Central Asia, another forgotten nexus emerges. Before the Silk Road connected Rome and China, before imperial networks spanned continents, there were proto-urban settlements and trade routes shaped by cultures we barely understand. The Afanasyevo and later Andronovo cultures, the Khmurchek horizon, the enigmatic populations of the Altai, all interacted in ways that shaped the movement of languages, metallurgy, and pastoralism across Eurasia. These cultures left burial mounds, petroglyphs, metal tools, and traces of migrations that would echo across millennia. But they left no written descriptions of themselves. Their identities come to us through what they carried, what they traded, and how their genes mixed with others. Even more striking is the appearance of early city-states in Central Asia's desert margins, places like Sarazm, Gonurdepe, and the urban centers of the Oxus civilization, also known as the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, BMAC. Between 2200 and 1700 BCE, this civilization built fortified cities, monumental architecture, sophisticated irrigation systems, and distinctive art objects featuring composite creatures and ritual iconography. BMAC interacted with Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and early Proto-Indo-European groups. Yet, despite their influence, they left almost no writing. Their seals contain images, but no interpretable script. Their religious structures suggest priestly authority, but no hymns or myths survive. When their cities fell, possibly due to climate change, possibly due to shifting trade routes, their story collapsed into archaeological fragments. This pattern of brilliance without narrative appears again in the ancient Korean peninsula, where the Gojoseon Kingdom, said to be the first Korean state, remains shrouded in myth. Textual references in later historical records suggest a founding around 2333 BCE, but archaeological evidence is sparse. Bronze daggers, dolmens, and elaborate burial sites point to social complexity, but the early history of Korea before the Three Kingdoms period is largely reconstructed through traditions written centuries after the events they describe. The original voices are gone. Yet perhaps the most haunting silence in Asia is the disappearance of entire linguistic families. In China, before the dominance of Sino-Tibetan languages, other language groups influenced place names, loanwords, and cultural practices. The Baiyu peoples of southern China, the Qiangich and Di tribes of the northwest, the Dongyi of Shandong. These groups appear in early texts only as outsiders to the emerging Chinese state, not as civilizations with their own achievements. Archaeology reveals that many of them possessed metallurgy, agricultural innovations, and regional trade networks. Yet their languages are extinct, their myths lost, their histories remembered only as footnotes in someone else's story. And then there is the enigma of Jomon, Japan. Long before the rise of the Yamato state, long before rice agriculture transformed the archipelago, the Jomon people created pottery that remains some of the oldest and most intricately decorated in the world. They built settlements along coasts and rivers, developed fishing techniques, crafted ritual figurines called dog, and maintained social networks across islands. Some of their sites show architectural planning and communal organization, but they left no writing. Their worldview survives only through the symbolic motifs on pottery and figurines, spirals, flame-like patterns, stylized faces. When the Yayoi culture arrived with agriculture and metallurgy, the Jomon world gradually dissolved, leaving behind artifacts without exegesis. In Southeast Asia, the pattern continues. The Hoa Binhian hunter-gatherers, the early rice cultivators of the Red River Delta, the metallurgical innovators of Banqiang, all contributed to the region's development, but remain overshadowed by later kingdoms like Angkor and Pagan. Speaking of Angkor, even this monumental Khmer empire, despite its massive stone temples and intricate bas-reliefs, experienced a decline so sudden that its reasons remain debated. Climate instability, political fragmentation, overextension, all are plausible. But the written records that might clarify the collapse are sparse. Most inscriptions focus on royal propaganda, not infrastructure, economy, or crisis. The everyday voices of Angkor's people, farmers, artisans, monks, are lost. One of the most fascinating and mysterious discoveries of recent decades lies deep beneath the Sea of Japan. The Yonaguni Monument. Whether it is a natural formation or a deliberately modified structure remains contested, but its stepped terraces and geometric features provoke unsettling questions about coastal settlements lost to rising seas. If ancient cultures once lived along coastlines now submerged, their stories would be irretrievable except for the stone traces that survived. And across Asia, from the Sunda Shelf to the Persian Gulf, submerged landscapes hint at forgotten migrations and drowned settlements dating back to the end of the last ice age. The maps of human prehistory are incomplete, not because nothing happened, but because rising waters erased evidence faster than archaeology could uncover it. Asia also reminds us that writing itself, once invented, can disappear. Scripts like Khitan Large and Small Script, Tangut Script, the Indus Script, Rongorongo, and Meroitic stand as partially or totally undeciphered reminders that literacy does not guarantee memory. When political systems collapse, when scribal traditions end, when cultural transmission is disrupted, writing becomes as mute as stone. Without context, symbols lose meaning. Without readers, archives turn into puzzles. The silence enveloping Asia's lost cultures is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fragmentation. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where long textual traditions anchor chronology, Asia's early past often appears through discontinuous snapshots: stone tools here, pottery there, a burial mound in one region, a collapsed city in another. We can trace migrations, model climate events, analyze DNA, and examine trade goods. Yet the interior narratives, the decisions, beliefs, and identities guiding these societies, remain inaccessible. What makes this particularly haunting is the sheer scale of Asia. It is the largest continent, containing the greatest diversity of environments, populations, and cultural trajectories. It is statistically implausible that the civilizations we know, China, India, Persia, Japan, represent the whole story. The gaps are too wide, the unexplained transitions too frequent, the abrupt appearances of innovation too dramatic. Something is missing, or rather, many somethings. The remnants of forgotten Asian civilizations challenge the very structure of historical thinking. They show that technological revolutions can happen without states, that urban systems can collapse without leaving textual witnesses, that languages can vanish without descendants, that powerful cultures can be remembered only through pottery shards and faint mentions in the chronicles of others. They reveal a world where innovation flickers across deserts, mountains, and coastlines like sparks from a fire. Bright for a moment, then extinguished, leaving only trace heat in the archaeological record. They suggest that the history of Asia is not a steady march, but a shifting constellation of rises and falls, expansions and retreats, each leaving incomplete imprints. And above all, they remind us that for every civilization we can name, there may be others we have not yet found or recognized, others whose ruins lie beneath sediment, jungle, water, or the foundations of modern cities, others hidden in myths or in undeciphered scripts, or in genetic lineages we do not yet understand. Asia's forgotten worlds stand as a vast, half-visible archive waiting to be decoded, a reminder that the past is far larger than the portion we have illuminated, and that beneath every historical certainty lies a shadow of something older, stranger, and profoundly human. If Asia's forgotten civilizations show us how easily knowledge can fracture across distance and time, then the deepest mystery of all emerges when we step back and look at the global pattern, when we trace the rises and falls not of one region, but of humanity as a whole. Across continents separated by oceans, climates, and cultural boundaries, we find the same haunting rhythm: flashes of brilliance followed by silence, monumental achievements followed by inexplicable decline, societies that mastered engineering, astronomy, navigation, or agriculture, only to vanish so thoroughly that their stories survive only as shadows in the archaeological record. When viewed together, these patterns suggest something profound: that human history may not be a linear ascent from primitive beginnings to modern complexity, but a series of forgotten cycles, each one rising, flourishing, then collapsing for reasons we still struggle to understand. This possibility becomes harder to ignore when we examine global climate records, ancient coastlines, and the geographic scars left by catastrophic events. At the end of the last ice age, between roughly 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, the planet experienced a period of extreme upheaval. The Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted in the northern hemisphere. Species went extinct. Massive floods tore across landscapes. Sea levels rose by more than 400 feet over several millennia, drowning entire coastlines and river valleys where early humans likely settled. If advanced cultures existed along those ancient shores, the evidence of their existence now lies hundreds of feet beneath the ocean. And while mainstream scholarship remains cautious, submerged ruins found off the coasts of India, Japan, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean raise unsettling questions about how much we have lost. Take Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site that predates agriculture, pottery, writing, and the earliest known cities. Built around 9600 BCE, its massive T-shaped pillars, carved with animals, symbols, and reliefs, form circular enclosures that suggest ritual or astronomical function. The complexity of its construction demands planning, skilled labor, and symbolic sophistication. Yet the people who built it were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers with no tradition of monumental architecture. The idea that such a site could exist at the edge of the Ice Age challenges traditional narratives about when complexity began. And even more puzzling, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Someone, thousands of years ago, covered the entire complex with tons of soil. Why? Was it ceremonial closure, protection, abandonment? The intention remains unknown. Nearby sites, still unexcavated, may reveal even older structures. Some archaeologists now suspect a network of ritual centers once spanned the region, signaling a cultural sphere far more complex than previously imagined. But without writing, we have no names for these people, no myths, no genealogies. Only carved stone and buried chambers hinting at a forgotten worldview. Further east, in the flooded Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, genetic and linguistic clues suggest that a vast Ice Age culture may have once existed in lands now submerged beneath the South China Sea. As sea levels rose, millions of people would have been displaced, carrying their traditions into island chains that later formed the Austronesian expansion. The archaeological remains of their earliest settlements lie underwater, out of reach. Their myths, preserved in fragments across Polynesia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, speak of ancestral homelands lost to rising seas, echoes of real geological events turned into origin stories. Off the coast of India, near the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans have revealed submerged geometric structures and artifacts dating back thousands of years. Debate continues over whether these represent natural formations or human settlements, but the possibility remains that entire cultural horizons were erased by sea level rise long before written history began. Similar mysteries surround Yonaguni in Japan, Andros in the Bahamas, and ruins near Alexandria in Egypt, sites where archaeology and geology intersect in ways that complicate simple explanations. Taken together, these global anomalies suggest a pattern of forgotten beginnings, episodes of complexity emerging during the late Ice Age or early Holocene, only to be disrupted by catastrophic climate events. If humanity did undergo cycles of building, dispersal, and regrowth, the archaeological record might show exactly what it shows now: a patchwork of brilliant but isolated achievements, disconnected not because they were unrelated, but because the connective tissue was washed away, buried, burned, or broken before writing could anchor it. This is not an argument for a single lost civilization, but for multiple, independent pulses of complexity, civilizations rising when conditions allowed and collapsing when conditions turned hostile, when droughts lasted centuries, when coastlines drowned, when volcanic eruptions darkened the sky, when migrations triggered conflict, when trade networks fractured. These disruptions would erase the fragile memory systems of oral cultures, leaving future generations to rebuild without knowing what came before. In this light, the global story of forgotten civilizations becomes not a catalogue of isolated mysteries, but a map of human resilience. Each silence marks not just a loss, but a rebirth. Each collapse becomes a crucible from which new cultures emerge, carrying fragments of older knowledge woven into new identities. The mythological flood stories shared across the world, from Mesopotamia to Polynesia, from India to the Americas, may preserve memories of real disasters experienced by ancestors in different places and times. These narratives, though shaped by symbolism, hint at environmental events powerful enough to reset cultural memory on a massive scale, and yet the silences remain immense. What symbolic traditions shaped the builders of the world's earliest megaliths? What astronomical knowledge guided the creation of alignment systems across continents? What navigational lore preceded the Polynesian expansion? What languages were spoken by the first urban planners of South Asia, or the pyramid builders of Sudan, or the stonemasons of Malta? What music, what poetry, what philosophy did they carry in their minds, never written, never carved into stone, and now lost? These questions are not merely academic. They remind us that we are living atop the ruins of countless forgotten attempts at civilization, that the distance between remembered history and lost history is thin, that the story we teach, the rise of agriculture, the birth of writing, the formation of states, is only one possible timeline among many, selected not because it was the only one, but because it is the only one that survived intact. But the most humbling implication is this: our own era, with its archives, satellites, and digital memory, is not immune to forgetting. If societal collapse occurred today, whether through environmental disaster, technological disruption, or geopolitical fracture, how much would remain legible millennia from now? Would future archaeologists marvel at skyscrapers without knowing the names of their builders? Would our digital libraries survive, or would they dissolve like the papyrus scrolls of Alexandria? Would our myths become the last surviving remnants of our worldview? The forgotten civilizations of the past are not warnings of doom, but reminders of fragility. They show that human complexity is not permanent, that knowledge must be actively sustained, and that memory, even the collective memory of a culture, can evaporate faster than we expect. They urge us to question our assumptions about permanence, progress, and legacy. And they leave us with a final, unsettling realization. The past is not fully known, nor fully lost. It is suspended between discovery and oblivion. Each excavation, each decipherment, each technological advance pushes back the darkness a little further, but the shadows remain deep. Somewhere beneath soil, jungle, desert, and sea lie the traces of worlds we have not yet imagined. Worlds built by people as intelligent, observant, and ambitious as we are, whose stories vanished not because they were unworthy, but because time is merciless. We live surrounded by ghosts we have not yet learned to see. And the more we uncover, the more we realize that humanity is far older, far more complex, and far more cyclical than the narrow window of recorded history suggests. The forgotten civilizations of Earth remind us that our story is not a line. It is a tapestry, full of missing threads, frayed edges, and patterns we are only beginning to unravel.